My name is Bora Varliyaci. I am the CEO of Digital Things, which is an investment and strategy focused advisory firm within the ICT sector. And we are the research partner of Digital Council Africa this year for the state of digital infrastructure research within the sub-Saharan Africa. So today I will share with you some of the key findings from this year's study. And I will start with the scope of the study and the content of today's discussion. The study this year with regards to digital state of this digital infrastructure in sub-Saharan Africa covers obviously sub-Saharan Africa from a geographic scope point of view. And we have also undertaken a deep dive to 10 selected countries by Digital Council as well. In terms of the infrastructure layers, we have covered international connectivity, terrestrial connectivity, as well as the last mile connectivity, both fixed and wireless point of view. Also, other key infrastructure assets such as data centers and tower infrastructure, alongside Internet of Things and OTT landscape in selected countries. I will start my topic and discussion with regards to digital infrastructure by mentioning the growing interdependency between different digital infrastructure assets. And this is driven by growing demand of data and the quantum of it, but more importantly, I think changing applications and network requirements. What I mean by that is, for example, we have seen emergence of cloud-based applications that are latency-centric. And what it means is the time that data needs to transition between the source and the end user is quite key to the performance of some of those applications. That means the computing of that data needs to take closer to the end users, which drives expansion of new data centers and all this so-called edge data center context. On the network side, we have also seen changing architectures such as centralized RAN, where you really need to have a good coordination of tower locations, fiber feeding to those head units, as well as the baseband units that are located at the data center premises. So the interrelation between data center, fiber, and tower infrastructure becomes growingly more important. At the same time, other drivers such as growing quantum of the content and the need to serve that content locally also drives the requirement for broadband infrastructure and supporting data center infrastructure to come much closer together. So with that said, I think it's really important to establish an overall and holistic understanding of these interdependencies between applications and services, service providers, and the infrastructure as a holistic view. So that's what this year's study aimed to achieve. Therefore, I will present you all the different layers of key digital infrastructure within sub-Saharan Africa. And I will start with global and Africa snapshots with regards to state of digital infrastructure. And from there on, we will deep dive into different layers of this underlying infrastructure. First, global view. As of March 2020, there were 66% of global population were unique mobile subscribers. That means 2 out of 3 people were mobile users. And half of the global population was mobile internet users. And these connections were delivered over 4G networks in majority, representing 52% of the total connections globally. Whereas over the recent years, we have seen a drastic decline on 2G subscriptions, currently representing around 36% of global subscriptions. And these 2G networks constantly and in an accelerated manner shifting to 3G and 4G connections globally. And this is driven by both expansion of the 4G footprint as well as operators' effort to shift their subscribers from legacy technologies to new capable, more broadband capable technologies, also eliminating their need to run parallel networks, and also release their important resources such as spectrum that they can use for new networks and services. There were about almost 5,000 data centers globally spread across 125 countries, and these are particularly the colocation data centers I'm talking about. And tower count is approaching to 5 million figure as of 2020. In terms of terrestrial and international connectivity, we have seen a continuous growth with the tune of 28% compound annual growth over the past 4 years between 2015 and 2019. And the international bandwidth demand growth has equal to doubling every 2 years. With that said, I think the key routes also has grown quite drastically. We have seen 3 times growth between 2014 and 18 on key international routes, which includes transatlantic, trans-Pacific, US, Latin America, inter-Asian routes. And if you look into the graph on the bottom left-hand side over there, we can see the growth of international bandwidth in Africa is at par with the other regions in the world. So there is the international capacity and connectivity, both from a demand and supply point of view, has been growing constantly and in a scalable manner. In terms of fixed connectivity, 55% of the households globally had fixed broadband connection, and big part of it was fiber-based connections, representing 31.2%, which are replacing gradually the legacy DSL networks, which today stands around just 10.6% point. And then we have seen fixed wireless, traditional fixed wireless networks still representing over 4%, and cable connections almost 9% of the fixed connections around the world. IoT connections represented about 12 billion as of 2019 and has been growing fast. And 65% of all mobile connections has been done over smartphones. Smartphones represented 65% of the mobile connections. And there were about almost 200 billion applications downloaded in 2018 globally, and this is expected to grow to 300 billion in next 3 years. And big part of these applications are either social networking, messaging, media productivity, and e-commerce, followed by the gaming. Now, if you look into Sub-Saharan Africa and how it compares to global benchmarks, in Sub-Saharan Africa, as of March 2020, we had 45% of the population being unique mobile subscribers in Sub-Saharan Africa. That means still more than half of the population do not have connectivity on the continent. And it is even worse with regards to mobile internet usage point of view, which represents only 26%, which is a quarter of the total African population, which is obviously quite low comparing to global benchmarks. And if you look into technology mix, 3G has taken over 2G connections recently, representing 52% of overall connections in Sub-Saharan Africa. 4G deployments has accelerated and exceeding today 50% population coverage, yet the adoption or active usage is just limited to 13%. And 2G, in line with the global trends, have been in decline and expected to continue to decline going forward, replaced by 3G and 4G connections. There were about 65 colocation data centers across 10 countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, and tower count is reaching to 160,000 as of 2020. In terms of terrestrial networks, we are reaching to the 1.2 million kilometer mark with regards to terrestrial fiber reach on the continent. And once the constructions that are ongoing at the moment are completed, that will mean 61% of the African population will be within 25 kilometers of a fiber node as of 2020. In terms of international bandwidth, we have seen, similar to in line with the global trends, 32% CAGR growth within past 4 years, reaching to 6 terabit per second to date. And big part of this international bandwidth connections or capacity supplied by submarine cables, and terrestrial connections represented 8.6%, only a very limited part of the international traffic. Fixed connectivity remains relatively limited comparing to global 55% figure. Sub-Saharan Africa represent only 2.4% of the household with a fixed broadband connection. And fiber has been growing, obviously, its share within this fixed broadband market, catching up with the DSL connections in 2020, and probably will be taking over this year total DSL connections on the continent, given that DSL connections has been declining constantly. Fixed wireless access represents 0.4% here. I think it's really important to mention that here we are talking about the traditional fixed wireless connections, which are provided through unlicensed bands. Otherwise, LTE-based fixed wireless has been growing drastically. And today it's estimated that almost 60% of the fixed connections on the continent are provided by fixed LTE type of fixed wireless connections. However, operators and regulators still report LTE-based fixed wireless connections as mobile connections, as they are not represented in these numbers. So if we were to add those numbers, probably we are looking almost 5% household penetration from a fixed broadband point of view on the continent. There were about 23 million IoT connections at the end of 2019 on the continent, and smartphones represented 45% of total mobile connections on the continent as well. The applications, there were about 17 billion applications downloaded in Sub-Saharan Africa in 2018, and this is expected to reach almost 45 billion in the next 3 years. And similar to in line with the global trends, again, social networking, messaging, media, productivity, and e-commerce are the common types of applications that are being downloaded and used by the population, and that is followed by the gaming with 5.1 billion applications downloaded, which is expected to double in the next 3 years. Now, if we start our deep dive in terms of state of digital infrastructure in Sub-Saharan Africa, the first layer is undersea cables that are bringing the international capacity to the shores of the continent. And we have seen a continuous growth and investment on undersea cables layer. We have seen both on the East Coast and West Coast Africa new cables landing within past few years. That includes sail and SAC systems on the West Coast, METIS on the East Coast, Line 2 expansion on the East Coast as well. And these new cables obviously have complemented already oversupplied market with additional capacity. And it is notable that with this growth and capacity growth enabled by upgrades of the existing systems as well, combined with the expansion such as ACE coming to South Africa as well. I mean, all those developments really create a situation where we are already reaching the demand by far. Only 5% of the design capacity today on the continent are utilized from an active use point of view. Now, what's interesting is obviously going forward, the announcement of new cable systems. While there are many announcements, I think 2 of them are quite important, which is Google's Equiona cable, which is expected to start landing from 2021 onwards to the west coast of the Africa. And then Facebook-led to Africa Consortium, which is going to deploy a massive submarine cable system all around Africa. So what's the significance of this? First of all, I mean, the capacity that will be provided by these cable systems are going to dwarf the capacity that is already there on the continent. And more importantly, I think looking into the traffic mix between Africa and the international routes today, particularly Africa and Europe, at least 35% of that traffic belongs to content providers. Now, these content providers, as well as other cloud service providers deploying their own infrastructure through implementation of these submarine cable systems, as well as bringing data to local locations as well, such as AWS, Microsoft, Google, establishing own data centers on the continent in recent days. Obviously, it will, I mean, those self-provision by these large users of content or capacity will impact the demand on other infrastructure providers. So it's an important point to note and take into account for future plans of the planned new cable systems, as the demand seems to be very, very minuscule comparing to the oversupply today. In terms of terrestrial networks, though, we are not able to tell the same story in terms of between demand and supply point of view. As much as, I mean, we have an oversupply of international capacity reaching to the shores of the continent, still the terrestrial network reach remains limited. And as I mentioned, only 8.6% of the international capacity on the continent was delivered by the terrestrial networks, and particularly the Central African region and landlocked countries, the limitation in terms of reach of fiber, and this reach of fiber mostly limited to main cities, and even within that main cities, certain locations. And therefore, I mean, the fiber reach to a greater population or greater population centers, villages, towns remains limited. That therefore limits the benefit of growing international capacity for the larger population on the continent. So with that said, I think there is this creates an opportunity for the infrastructure operators over there who can go and complement this infrastructure gap on selected markets. Yet, I mean, it doesn't come without challenges, because we have seen, I mean, some of the key reasons over there are either monopolies or government policies not necessarily supporting or providing confidence on this long life, long-term infrastructure investments. So there should be more effort in bridging this gap, so that we can really see that more than half of the population getting connected and being able to afford these connections and become active users of broadband services that are enabled by these developments. In terms of satellites, I think satellites have been around more than 25 years on the continent now. And at one point, there was a thought that this submarine cable and growth on capacity will negate the need for satellite networks. Whereas, I mean, what we still see is satellites remains a key means of connectivity for rural Africa, as well as central countries which doesn't have shores for getting the benefits of submarine cables. Satellite remains a main technology that are being utilized. Also, I mean, there have been lots of developments from a technology point of view on the satellite as well. And with the emergence of high throughput satellites, today we are able to deliver up to 10 gigabit per second per satellite capacity, which is expected to grow to 60 gigabit per second by 2025. So as I said, I mean, the limited reach of the fiber networks or other broadband infrastructure to deeper Africa makes it necessary for satellite operators to continue their operations and expand indeed their reach serving to this market. The challenge with the satellite is rather costly VSAT terminals. Therefore, I mean, main use of satellite remained within the business segments in terms of lodges, mining areas, game farms, and residential use or reach to larger population by satellite still remains limited. So then what? I mean, then to bridge this gap, then we have seen other initiatives coming alongside the satellite as well, such as the Loon project of Google. And it has been, you know, a popular topic on the media for quite a few years now. But this year, we have seen deployment of these systems on the ground as well. We have seen Telkom Kenya launching 35 Loon balloons, providing a service covering over 50,000 square kilometers. And we have also seen the announcement by Vodacom in Mozambique for LTE services for through Loon as well. I mean, Loon enables, therefore, through a balloon structure, coverage to rural areas, and these Loon balloons can carry a multitude of technologies, but primary deployment that we see today is on the 4G technology that is providing a direct connectivity to the end user devices, so there is no need for additional terminal like VSAT. So it seems to be a viable alternative going forward also to bridge these difficult to reach areas, connectivity to difficult to reach areas going forward. In terms of fixed access connectivity, this is an interesting graph over here on the left-hand side. And if you look into the details of that graph, red color represents DSL connections, and we can clearly see a decline, a significant decline on DSL connections on the continent. And that is being replaced by the fiber networks, which are represented in blue on those bar graphs. And fiber has been growing. And yet, I mean, if you look into the top line, we can see implied decline in terms of fixed broadband household penetration. Now, I want to clarify that because that implied decline is not necessarily a real decline, because as I mentioned, with the introduction of LTE networks and connections being provided, fixed wireless connections provided by these LTE networks, which are still reported as mobile connections, are indeed a big replacement of the legacy technologies on the continent. So if we were to add that fixed wireless LTE from an estimate point of view, we are looking at least a double number of fixed wireless connections or total number of fixed connections on the continent. So this is an important caveat over here. So whereas traditional fixed wireless access over here seems to be stagnant, I think the adoption of LTE and more recently 5G based fixed wireless access is really taking over other technologies in recent days. In terms of fiber, we have seen certain countries really driving this aggressively, like in Mauritius, we see over 90% household penetration, as well as some other smaller island nations such as Reunion or Seychelles achieving significant fiber reach in their countries. And countries like South Africa, you know, represents the highest number of fiber-based fixed connections, reaching to almost 800,000 in 2020. So there is definitely a market or certain countries driving the fiber reach, but in general, except few other African countries such as Kenya, who has been really driving this agenda as well, fiber remains a niche technology still, which is deployed to selected higher income areas and not necessarily driving the mass adoption of the technology on the continent. I want to elaborate a bit more with regards to LTE and 5G based fixed wireless service offering. In particular, I mean, LTE based fixed wireless offering has been on the uptrend. And the reason for that is for operators who have invested in this in this LTE networks have excess capacity on those networks on their hand, because the mobile use of those networks are limited. Only 13% of the total connections are LTE connections on the continent. Therefore, I mean, there is a drive to commercialize those excess capacity, which has been kind of working fine and well in African context, because the lack of fixed broadband service offering on the continent and the flexibility offered by LTE-based fixed wireless access, which allows you to very fast go-to-market strategy, as well as enable you to align your capex spend with growing demand and revenue. It has been a popular technology in recent years. So we are definitely seeing traditional DSL and traditional unlicensed fixed wireless kind of service offering, because they have limitations in terms of capacity and quality of connections. And those technologies are nowadays being replaced by LTE and in particular LTE-based fixed wireless access. And in recent days, we have seen emergence of the 5G-based fixed wireless access as well, alongside the fiber offering over there. And in terms of DSL, I mean, there is definitely, technology is at the end of its lifespan, and certain countries such as South Africa, I mean, Telkom has announced the end of life and discontinuation of DSL services this year as well. If we take a closer look in terms of fiber developments on the continent, I mean, and how it compares to the rest of the world, looking into sub-Saharan African penetration, which stands at 0.9%, comparing to other regions, is very, very limited reach. I mean, that's kind of a clear indication of a niche nature of this technology, despite, I mean, constant efforts and lots of achievements on the continent on certain countries. If you look into overall landscape, though, still the reach and service uptake remains limited from a fiber-based service offering point of view. And on the bottom graph over there, we can see where most of these connections on the continent are. We can see South Africa leading the market with almost 800,000 connections, followed by Mauritius and Kenya around 300,000 mark, which then followed by Tanzania just under 200,000, and most other countries following that are really far behind these four countries. So definitely, I mean, certain countries are driving this agenda, and there are lots of investments and effort going on. But again, if you look into the overall larger picture, the fiber remains a niche technology. And why is that? I mean, if you look into some of the challenges and main drivers behind the fiber as well, some of the key challenges in front of the fiber is obviously exclusion of rural and low-income communities due to affordability challenges. And most of the fiber deployments have focused on higher income, denser areas, which is more commercially viable. And therefore, when it starts reaching to other areas, the viability becomes a bit more difficult. And despite, I mean, there have been developments in terms of deployment methods, such as aerial fiber deployments, or in certain cases, even pinning the fiber on estate walls and all, really brings the cost down and makes it possible to extend this footprint. Still, it is not a mass market technology at the moment. In terms of also, as I mentioned, fixed wireless alternatives and MNOs trying to monetize their current investment on the LTE networks, increase the competition and the price points that are offered on the market for broadband connectivity point of view, that creates another challenge. As well as, I mean, policy and regulatory frameworks sometimes make it really difficult, including some of the challenges with regards to rapid deployment requirements of these networks, because the utility nature of this network, which requires trenching and which requires deployment of hardcore infrastructure assets into the ground, literally, requires quite a lot of permits, quite a lot of engagements with the community, with the public authorities as well. Sometimes that permitting could take quite a lot of time, effort, and on certain markets we have seen even unaffordable fees being proposed by local authorities to allow wayleaves or use of road reserves for deployment of the fiber. On the other hand, I mean, where there are established players from a service provider point of view, we could also see some monopolist behavior coming in, as well as some of the challenges introduced by the property managers or owners trying to leverage from these developments as well, which limits the competition as well as the appetite for fiber deployment eventually. On the other hand, I mean, there are lots of drivers for fiber to indeed expand its reach and density on the continent as well. And these, starting with growing data and bandwidth on the continent by the end users, is the main driver of it. And fiber really provides a robust technology alternative to the wireless options. So that's definitely a key driver of fiber networks. As well as, I mean, we have seen certain countries launching national broadband plans with particular fiber targets associated with them, assisting with some of those deployments. As well as, I mean, the recent pandemic, as much as it created lots of challenges for the society and communities, it opened up quite a lot of opportunities where connectivity is at the core. So remote working, schooling, networking, and doing everything from home required quite reliable networks and quite performing networks, which fiber is second to none. And in terms of also network sharing and collaboration between the service providers and some of the open access models adapted on certain markets helps reducing the cost of infrastructure or sharing this cost between different service providers. Definitely helps to extend the fiber reach to larger communities. On the other hand, the wireless technology developments, such as move from legacy 2G, 3G technologies to more bandwidth-hungry 4G, 5G networks, not only requires higher bandwidth from a backhaul point of view, but also it requires densification of sites. And sometimes, I mean, centralized RAN type of deployments requires more fiber between the tower and the head-end unit. And all those things really contributes to the densification of fiber, hence, I mean, more fiber deployments on the continent. In terms of mobile connectivity, particularly mobile broadband point of view, if you look into the state of sub-Saharan Africa, we see on the left-hand side a graph over there, which represents unique mobile internet user penetration as percentage of the population in different countries. And as we can see, only South Africa over there with dark blue color represents 52% population penetration from a mobile internet user point of view, and most other countries on the continent are still below that half mark figure. So in terms of, I mean, average, we are looking, as I mentioned earlier, the quarter of the population, just over a quarter of the population being mobile internet users. And that is really, really a low number with 287 million mobile internet connections as of 2020. And if you look into supply side of the things, this is not necessarily only a supply side problem, because still 3G coverage represents about 70% population coverage as of 2019, and 4G population coverage is at a half mark point from a population coverage point of view. So there is enabling mobile technologies offered on reaching to the populations, yet the uptake of those services remains limited, and there are lots of demand side challenges that we need to address, including but not limited to affordability of handsets in particular. In terms of technology mix on the mobile point of view, we have seen, as I mentioned, a trend of 2G connections declining over time, and today just representing only a third of connections on the continent, which is replaced particularly by the growth of 3G over there, reaching from 187 million connections in 2016 to over 430 million connections in 2020, now representing more than half of the connections on the continent. 4G, I mean, despite global uptake and growth of 4G, the adoption and reach of 4G on the continent has been limited so far. We have seen quite a lot of network deployments in recent years. Yet, I mean, they started a bit late due to unavailability of spectrum, as well as device affordability on the end user point of view, really limit the take up of these services, this technology service on the continent. Therefore, I mean, we have seen 4G deployments accelerating, adoption growing, yet still at a slow pace. But we expect this to grow much faster going forward because I mean, end user devices.
Mr. Bora,
yes,
we have 5 minutes remaining. Can you maybe please assist to wrap up?
I have still 5 slides to cover. We have to cover them all, please.
Okay, no problem.
Thank you. So in terms of 4G, as I mentioned, the uptake is going to grow in an accelerating manner because 4G devices are becoming more affordable. We have seen some local manufacturing also assisting with this as well. Also, operators are, as I mentioned earlier, shifting their subscriber base from legacy technologies to modern technologies to relieve their resources, as well as to reduce the network duplication and the cost of it. In terms of 5G, we have seen lots of trials going on in several countries, but we have seen some commercial launch of initial 5G services as well. In particular, South Africa, we have seen Rain, Vodacom, MTN launching initial 5G services. And most of these services, to be clear, are within fixed wireless space. And not most, indeed, all of these services are fixed wireless connections, which are obviously providing another alternative to 5G fiber type of connectivity on the last mile. However, I mean, it's important to recognize that still 5G is at early stages, hence the end user devices CPEs are quite costly, so it will take time until they reach to a point that is more affordable, hence the reach of these services from affordability point of view expands to wider population. In terms of mobile use of 5G, I think it's a story still far ahead of us because it requires a deployment of new spectrum bands at higher bands, which means more sites and which means more fiber. So those deployments together with the end user devices becoming more affordable, it will take quite some time, and it comes under the light of 4G networks and the reach of 4G networks being larger and adoption being lower. So monetization or recoup of the investment of 4G is still going to happen before the 5G mobile deployments takes precedence. In terms of mobile devices, again, I mean, we are looking into growth in terms of smartphones reaching to overtaking the feature phones in 2020. So definitely it's encouraging. That means more shift to broadband usage. Yet, with this 50% penetration as of 2020, we still have half the connections still to shift to smartphones. So we are at a half mark point. What it also means is with the proliferation of smartphones, the usage of broadband and network loads are going to grow, and this usage are going to take place mostly in indoor places. So it kind of underlines the need for further investment in DAS systems or indoor coverage systems that will to support this growing demand. In terms of towers, which are quite a backbone of the mobile broadband delivery on the continent, we have developed a benchmark figure over there on the left-hand side map, and it shows you the population or people per tower densification across different countries. And that ranges from 1,900, 1,900 people per tower in South Africa to 19,000 people per tower in DRC, quite a large gap in between. Yet, I mean, it is important to take note of this gap because that kind of indicates where some of the infrastructure delivery challenges are. Currently, I mean, most of the towers on the continent are really concentrated on a few countries, and Nigeria and South Africa each has almost 31,000 towers today. And 40% of the towers on the continent are owned and managed by the tower companies. The challenge, though, remains in the rural areas, expansion of these towers to rural areas, and there have been recent efforts by the operators to deploy some low-cost solutions to expand to extreme rural coverage type of drive. Yet, as we can see from this map, there's a big gap between the countries, and that needs to be addressed going forward to expand the broadband reach. And that also gives an opportunity for the infrastructure operators to find ways, innovative ways to bridge this gap in a sustainable manner. In terms of, I mean, tower, again, if we talk briefly about some challenges and drivers. On the challenges side, again, tower is similar to fiber, large infrastructure game with long-term return profiles. And over there, I think towers are subject to more permits in terms of environmental permits, aviation permits, as well as urban development type of considerations by the city councils. So all those permitting requirements can be quite extensive and can take time. It can reach to year to year. I mean, we have seen cases where a tower permit takes 2 years to secure. So obviously that kind of lengthy permitting process is going to is a key challenge in front of tower developments. The second one is unreliable grid energy on the continent, because particularly, I mean, where electrification rate is very low or the grid quality is very low, it makes it necessary to incorporate other type of energy sources to support these towers, such as generators or renewable energy incorporation, which obviously increases the capital requirements of those deployments, B, operational requirements, because somebody needs to attend to those systems to refuel and to maintain those generators on a regular basis. Also, poor transportation conditions makes it difficult to reach those towers time to time, particularly in the rural areas, makes it difficult and more expensive to operate and prone to security risks. We have seen quite a big challenge in front of battery theft and vandalism of some of these towers in recent days as well. So that is another key area of consideration in operating a tower. And other one is really dependency on imported materials, because most of the tower related infrastructure are manufactured elsewhere. Generators, tower itself, batteries, and all those elements are subject to hard currencies. And obviously, if your cost is on a hard currency and revenues on local currency, you'll be subject to foreign exchange fluctuations, and it's a problem to be mitigated. And that goes into the funding as well, because lots of the tower infrastructures are funded internationally on a hard currency base. So that makes it difficult either for the operator itself or the service providers who are taking space on these towers from a currency fluctuation point of view. And sometimes, I mean, when the towers are deployed in deep rural areas, the transmission costs and challenges could be a barrier for the operators themselves and may not reveal commercially viable business cases, which also reduces the demand for a tower space as well. On the other hand, main drivers point of view, the technology shift, as I mentioned, to 4G and 5G networks require adoption of new spectrum, high band spectrum. Both on the mid-band point of view, we have seen now introduction of 3.5 gigahertz, for example, on 3G networks, 2.6 gigahertz on 4G. All this higher band spectrum requires densification of the towers, and eventually going forward, when we get to a stage of millimeter waves, obviously it will even require this densification to be, in a much greater scale. And in terms of, as I mentioned, the growth or adoption of these broadband technologies on an indoor point of view, and usage of indoor requires replacement of those indoor coverage systems as well. And again, given the cost and nature of these investments, it opens up an opportunity for neutral infrastructure operators to go in there and mitigate those cost risks for the MNOs and other service providers, which presents an opportunity, as well as some of the power challenges can be seen as opportunities as well, because tower cos or infracos who are specializing in operating infrastructure and energy can mitigate some of those risks more efficiently than the operators themselves. So there are lots of opportunities in front of tower players as well. In terms of data centers, we have, as I mentioned, we have seen growing number of data centers in recent years on the continent, particularly on certain hubs such as South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya. And we have seen international and large players coming in, private equity investment from international players coming into these countries as well. So it is important to note that data centers are very much hand in hand with broadband developments on the continent, and where we see certain enabling elements coming together, we see demand for data centers and the investment over there growing as well. To date, we have counted about 65 co-location data centers, mostly at tier 3 level on the continent. At least 10 new data center constructions are ongoing as we speak. In terms of market drivers on the data centers point of view, increasing adoption of internet and digital services is one of the main drivers. On the other hand, localization of the traffic on the continent by the cloud providers, by the content service providers, or driven by the governments in terms of data protection laws or data residency laws, require more data center investments on the continent, as well as some of the other drivers over there is really shifting enterprise workloads to cloud. And obviously then you will need to provide those cloud services closer to those end users, as well as a networking point of view. As I mentioned, some of those recent developments in terms of decentralized networking architectures, shifting the computing power to the edge of the data centers and delivery of components from their services from those edge data centers are driving more data center investments. But on the contrary, I mean, there are lots of challenges in front of some of the investment drivers on the continent as well. One of them is digital reach. Still, the number of internet users and broadband users are limited on the continent. The power remains a main challenge in terms of this key element operating a data center, reliable and cheap grid power. Unfortunately, most countries do not necessarily have reliable grids, making it more difficult and costly to operate these data centers. Connectivity issues, particularly for inland countries where you are limited to only a single backbone provider, can provide challenges. So in terms of connectivity issues in front of the data centers, as I mentioned, the single provider, particularly on the inland or landlocked countries, can make it a bit more difficult to make it viable, some of these data center operations and investments, as well as climate, skill factors, and other political and economic risk could really impact some of the data center investment decisions. And in recent days, access to funding for large infrastructure projects due to economic uncertainty that is posed by the COVID-19 pandemic is also likely to impact the access to funding for these large infrastructure projects as well. In terms of, I mean, if you look into mapping of some of these key drivers and challenges on the continent, we can see relative high importance or drive by growing internet and digital service adoption on the continent, as well as localization of the traffic through content or global cloud providers locally does impact, does drive these data center investments relative to other factors. And the major issues, if you look into there, are power and connectivity in front of the data center investments. And internet exchange point of view, we have seen quite a lot of growth over there now. There were about 55 IXPs in 49 cities in 36 countries in sub-Saharan Africa this year. So this is 3 times growth within the past decade. And again, I mean, this really emphasizes the importance of localizing the data in neutral facilities where you don't have to traverse the traffic unnecessarily internationally. And we have seen most of these IXPs delivered or deployed by carrier neutral providers, and governments is the second category. Almost 28% of these IXPs are operated by governments. And lastly, the impact of COVID-19 on digital infrastructure landscape. In terms of revenue, in the short term, what we have seen indeed a positive impact. We have seen, given most of the activity has shifted remote working and remote studying from homes, this drives the demand for broadband connectivity. Therefore, I mean, in the short term, most of the service providers have seen an uptake in terms of the revenues, except certain cases where connectivity connectivity revenues were more related to tourism kind of roaming revenues. On certain markets, we have seen some negative impact, but in general, short-term impact has been relatively positive from a market point of view. Medium to long term, we expect some of the behaviors that are developed throughout COVID-19 pandemic to continue. For example, certain large organizations announcing they will make home working permanent for some of their staff, as well as online education is likely to continue beyond COVID-19 as well. This will drive need for connectivity further. And as much as I mean, on the negatives point of view, there have been impact on hotels, retail chains, restaurant point of view. We are expecting that the impact of those developments will be relatively limited with regards to telecommunication services, given the priority of these services over other expenses. In terms of network and technology, we have seen the importance of a growing investment demand driven by the operators as well as the governments. As you know, COVID-19 highlighted the digital divide on the continent once again. Hence, we expect more drive in terms of expansion of broadband networks to a larger population on the continent. Yet, as I mentioned earlier, funding may be a bit delayed given the short-term uncertainty and risks with regards to the economic outlook on the continent. In terms of operations and maintenance, we have seen most operators were able to cope well with the challenges of COVID-19, having business continuity plans in place, and therefore we haven't seen major disturbances in terms of service levels. And the impact over the networks have been an uptick at a certain period, up to 20 to 80% surge. However, after a period, we have seen those traffic workloads normalizing as the workloads are spread towards scattered around the network as people are working more from home and remote locations. Indeed, I mean, in certain cases, we have seen it contributed positively to network congestion problems. So with that said, I think that will be the end of my presentation for the oversight and overview of the digital infrastructure developments in Sub-Saharan Africa. Thank you very much for joining me for today's session, and I look forward to engaging further in upcoming sessions. Thank you.